The voices of the dead echo throughout a centuries-old music hall in Cincinnati, Ohio. Workers discover a crypt filled with skeletons, and the secrets of 1,000 bones are unleashed. When the dead are disturbed, anthropologists turn to science to restore peace to the living and put to rest the ghosts of the past. In Cincinnati, Ohio, while working in one of the elevator shafts of the old music hall, the floor suddenly gives way under a pounding jackhammer. Reaching into the soil, a worker pulls out a human skull.
Don't do anything. I'm gonna go get somebody.
The crew halts their work, and a music hall official is summoned.
What'd you guys find? We're busting a hole in the slab.
Carefully feeling around the broken-up floor, the workers find more skulls.
Don't touch anything. Call the police. Stay here.
Before long, hundreds of bones are exposed from this hidden crypt. The story dominates the local news. TV and newspaper accounts reveal rumors that Music Hall was built on the grounds of an old potter's field or public cemetery, and that this was not the first time that skeletons had emerged from a so-called resting place at this site. The bones are taken to the Hamilton County Morgue for examination. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office typically receives only a small number of skeletal remains per year. This was an exceptional amount. It was soon obvious that the services of a professional anthropology team would be needed to document and analyze the bones. Dr. Anthony Przigian is called in to provide his expertise.
Well, as a consultant for the coroner's office, I was asked to come in and examine the materials and determine whether or not it constituted a crime scene, to do a standard investigation, identification of the remains.
Nearly 88 pounds of them, and that they seem very old. It also appears that this jumble of bones, over 2,500 separate bones and fragments, does not represent a crime. When the bones are discovered, Elizabeth Murray is a graduate student in anthropology, and Dr. Przigian is her advisor. He encourages her to take the lead in the investigation.
Obviously, the first thing you have to establish is that this is not a forensic matter. You know, this is not something that we need to involve law enforcement in. We don't need to investigate this from any criminal point of view. So then it becomes a research project. It becomes a mission, if you will, to explore who these people were, why they came to be there.
But to figure out who these people were and why they came to be unceremoniously dumped beneath the basement of such a grand old building would require a detailed investigation.
I was personally very interested in finding out how these bones came to be in the basement of this elevator shaft, and no one seemed to know about it. This wasn't a graveyard. This was a cement tomb that had been intentionally made, and a group of people had been tossed haphazardly into this cement tomb. The initial interest on my part was, how did this come to be here, and how has it been lost to Cincinnati's history?
These bones were most likely early Cincinnati citizens, and this investigation could give them a voice again. Dr. Murray begins her investigation at Music Hall, where she meets with Robert Howes. Howes is a violinist with a passion for music and history. He's also the official archivist of Music Hall.
I'm sure that you have things that I'm not aware of, or at least I would assume so. So I think it'd be a nice opportunity for us to, take a second look at the documentation from that time. It's an amazing structure. Has it always looked like this?
No, actually, what we see today is due to 1895-96 renovation, really a complete redesign of the auditorium. Because it was originally just one long room with a flat floor. This is a raked floor, a nice theater floor. And also didn't have a stage, it didn't have an orchestra pit.
Music Hall was dedicated in 1878 and built for a little under $500,000. It was designed in high Victorian Revival Gothic style and was to accommodate two main functions: the center building for musical events and its wings for exhibitions and conventions. Since its construction, the building has undergone more than a dozen renovations, totaling upward of $12 million.
Okay, well, let me show you the freight elevator.
So this is where it happened.
That's right.
Seeing the freight elevator shaft does reinforce one thing for Murray. It's an odd place to find a crypt of bones. Much of the history of Music Hall and Cincinnati is stored at the Cincinnati Historical Society. Howes is very familiar with its collections of documents and deeds. One set of maps in particular proves to be a gold mine, rich in clues about the original use of the Music Hall property, which Murray hopes will verify if the land really was once the location of a potter's field.
Yes, exactly.
You've seen the early 1800s maps, haven't you?
Yes, I have. There's one in particular that I think we should take a look at. It's a 1819 map.
Oh, the Farnsworth map.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
That's great.
Well, let's see if we can find it here. These are the map drawers.
Yeah.
Let's try this one.
Ah, there it is.
Yep, this is the Farnsworth map.
Yeah, public burying ground.
The Farnsworth map provides some proof that the old stories about Music Hall were true. The map clearly shows that there was a public burial ground between lots 52 and 54. Lot 53 is where Music Hall stands today. This grand old Cincinnati landmark was built right on top of a potter's field, where hundreds of poor and unknown deceased were laid to rest. This is a critical clue, as it provides the first piece of evidence that connects bones to the property. But this information still doesn't explain why workers found bones in the floor of the elevator shaft. Additional records in the archive reveal more specific information about the history of this parcel of land. City health records show that throughout the early 1800s, thousands died in Cincinnati during a series of cholera epidemics. When disease orphaned hundreds of children, the city reclaimed the potter's field and built an orphanage on the property. This was the first major structure built on this land. The Orphans Asylum gave shelter to children for several decades before moving to another location. Further records indicate that the old orphanage building on Lot 53 temporarily housed Civil War soldiers. In 1870, the construction of Sangerfest Hall, Cincinnati's first public exhibition and performance space, transformed the old orphanage site. But Sangerfest Hall had a very short life.
Sangerfest Hall didn't last on that property too long because it had a tin roof. And what they quickly found out was you can't have a music festival in a rainstorm when you have a tin roof.
Sangerfest Hall is demolished just a few years after it is built, and plans are quickly made for a new and improved music hall to take its place. By late 1876, ground is broken for the new music hall, which, like its predecessor, is situated along the banks of the Miami-Erie Canal that connects the Ohio River to the Great Lakes.
Now this one also shows the canal, right?
Yes, a canal was put in, I believe, around 1823, and that had something to do with choosing or maintaining an interest in that lot, because the canal would allow convenient access to Music Hall with various large items that would be used in an exhibition.
The archives are also the repository for old Cincinnati newspapers, the media record of their day. an article from 1876 catches her attention with its vivid details about the groundbreaking for music hall. The story in the Sunday edition of the Cincinnati commercial newspaper describes the unruly antics of a gathering mob when word gets out that skeletons are surfacing from the ground of the old and nearly forgotten Potter's Field. The reporter writes,
"The crowds watch each new discovery with ghoulish interest. Bone after bone, as soon as thrown out, is turned over with a scientific application of kicks. Dirty fingers are poked into empty eye sockets. Jaw bones are experimentally hammered with heavy canes. Poor ghost. And by night, there come medical students to steal the poor skulls."
According to Howes, the discovery of these bones was an embarrassment to city officials, who, when asked by the public if the bones were a health risk, said they had no authority over the situation. Murray had great hopes that these bones were the ones found in the basement floor of Music Hall.
Now, one would initially assume, okay, that explains why these bones, came to be in this elevator shaft, but that's not the case. There was a gentleman on the board of directors for Music Hall who was also on the board of directors for a very beautiful and famous old cemetery here in town called Spring Grove Cemetery. And because this gentleman was on the board at both, he arranged for the remains to be relocated in Spring Grove Cemetery.
So, shortly after their discovery, several wagon loads of bones are brought to Spring Grove and buried in an unmarked plot near the tiny graves of a group of children, some of whom may have come from the old orphans asylum. It looked as if Murray had run into a dead end about solving the mystery of where the Music Hall bones had come from, or who these people might have been. But the more she thought about the rumor being true, that the building was built on top of a cemetery, the more she wondered if there was any truth to it being haunted. John Engst was a night watchman who for many years worked the late shift at Music Hall. After all his late-night journeys through the building, he had no doubts that the restless spirits of the Potter's Field dead wandered its halls. Following ghosts might be a rather unorthodox way to gather information about who buried the bones under Music Hall. But as it turns out, they provide some pretty solid leads that begin to reveal the secrets of the Music Hall bones. A stone crypt filled with human bones was discovered by construction workers at the Cincinnati, Ohio Music Hall. Robert Howes and Dr. Elizabeth Murray uncovered important evidence that Music Hall was constructed on land once used as a public burial ground. Unfortunately, this information did not provide the answer as to why the crypt of bones was found over 100 years later in the floor of an elevator shaft. But now Dr. Murray had a new lead.
In researching the archives of Music Hall, I met a number of interesting people, but the most colorful was the old night watchman.
John Engst was a night watchman at Music Hall when the bones were discovered.
This is a guy that had worked at Music Hall for 20 years or more and used to go around the building at night with his flashlight and keys, making sure the building was secure. And he swore that the building was haunted. He recalled that every time he went near that elevator shaft, his hair stood on end. And he had told people that he was sure the building was haunted. He was there the night the bones were discovered. And in fact, he said that he was leaning over the shoulders of the construction crew because he knew the bones were down in that elevator shaft. And as soon as they punched through, they realized it wasn't solid down there, but it was a hollow space. And the night watchman said, stick your hand down in there. And the guy said, I'm not sticking my hand down there. And he said, go on, stick your hand down there. And when he did, he said he pulled up a human skull. And the night watchman said that was the closest thing to a religious experience he had had. He really believed that there was something more to music hall than met the eye. And, you know, I wouldn't question the guy who walked around there at night for 20 years. Certainly, if music hall had its ghosts, the night watchman would be the person to know about it.
John was not the first music hall caretaker to go on the record saying this building was haunted. The same 1876 newspaper story that reported the accidental discovery of skeletons during music hall's construction also told about another night watchman's report of ghosts on his watch.
The night watchman in charge of the building was greatly annoyed by mysterious sounds whenever he went within the building. By night, the sound of stealthy footsteps followed him. When he stopped, they ceased, and there were strange knocking sounds at all hours of the night. And sometimes sounds of mocking laughter broke the silence. Sometimes strange whispers.
Were these stories a night watchman's hoax or reports from true believers? Murray wonders if there were more ghostly tales, so she continues to look through the old newspapers. Nearly 50 years after the first article, she notices another from the Daily Times Star.
In 1927, they were ready to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of this building, the big 50th anniversary celebration. And so they were doing a lot of modernization of the building at that time.
There it was. The ghosts had led her to another report of bones once again disturbed from graves in the old Potter's Field. The writer wrote,
digging a deep, broad trench under the south wing of Music Hall, which is now being rebuilt, workmen discovered a valley of death. They discovered 65 graves and unearthed a large quantity of human bones.
And then, a few lines further down the page, she found exactly what she'd been looking for.
If it is agreeable to the city officials, I will provide a coffin and arrange to have all the bones buried again in a single grave in the same resting place where they have reposed for probably a century or more.
According to the paper, the Music Hall Association had agreed that the construction company would rebury the remains in a single cement tomb in the basement of the building. At last, there was proof of how and why the bones were buried underneath Music Hall. It was apparently a convenient solution to reinterring some very lost souls. Now Dr. Murray was ready to pursue the next major part of the Music Hall bones mystery, figuring out who these people were, how many of them were buried together, and what their bones could tell her about their lives and perhaps their deaths.
The bones that came out of Music Hall were extremely fragmented. They had been, you think about it, they were buried in the early 1800s. A construction project happened on that ground in the late 1800s. These bones were somehow left behind and then discovered in 1927. And in that process, you know, nature as well as human construction, modern construction, were taking its toll on those bones. So you see a lot of fragmentation, a lot of old breaks.
Her first task sounded simple enough until she looked hard at what was an enormous pile of mixed up bones. She needed to sort the collection bone by bone, right sides from left, which results in grouping all the bones by regions of the body. The collection was hopelessly jumbled and had many bones either missing or damaged. The sorting showed that the larger and sturdier a bone was, the more frequently it would appear in the sample. The smaller bones of the body, those of the fingers, for example, were totally absent. It was clear that each time these skeletons were moved, only the larger bones had survived unscathed. Or more likely, Murray concluded, that the recovery of the bones at the construction sites had been quick and haphazard. Murray could not reconstruct a single complete skeleton, so she had to study the collection as a group or population, rather than being able to study individuals.
The major questions that we always encounter in a collection like this is what's the minimum number of individuals, how many people were there, and then secondly, separate out adults from children, and then beyond that, study the adults for indicators of age, of sex, of stature, anything like that that we can look at.
The bones of the pelvis are critical in helping to establish sex. As a result of puberty, the female pelvis grows wider from side to side and deeper from front to back to allow for childbirth. Females typically have smaller joint surfaces than males.
Here, we can see a small socket for the hip in the female. In the male, we can see a large hip socket, but in this female, it's clear she had a reproductive history. If we look at this aspect where ligaments attach, we actually see a pregnancy scar. Ligaments attach here to the pelvis, and the stresses of pregnancy pull and create this deep depression or scar that indicates that she had a reproductive history.
Murray is also curious about the average height of these individuals, and as an anthropologist knows that measurements from specific bones help estimate how tall a person was.
Any of the bones that are longer than they are wide in the body will give some indicator of height. Now, some of those bones relate more directly to height than others. And in this case, because there were so many represented, I chose the femur as the bone to estimate height.
Information interpreted from the bones is beginning to create a snapshot of people who lived over 100 years ago.
You know, many people say, oh, our ancestors were so short, or modern people are so much taller than they were in the past. The average height for the women in the music hall collection was 5'2", and the average height for males was 5'7". Now, when you look at worldwide statures, that's not so far off the mark from today.
Although she analyzed the bones as a group, there were times when she couldn't help noticing a few striking individuals.
You see the delicate facial features and the smooth forehead. Clearly this was a lovely young woman. Her wisdom teeth are just now erupting. She may have been 18 years old. And I say to myself, you know, how did someone like this wind up in a potter's field in Cincinnati? Did she have no one to take care of her?
Teeth not only help assess the age of an individual, but they also reveal things about a person's dental health before they died.
You see some people with really nice teeth, just like you would today, but then you also see people that have some significant dental problems that would be easily remedied today. You see people with extensive cavities and abscesses, very painful conditions for which there was probably little or no treatment. These teeth are very badly worn. You can see the top of the tooth is worn off, and you can see some severe cavity in this location.
Dental practitioners existed in Cincinnati during the 1800s, but only people with financial means would have seen one to have a tooth pulled, to take care of a painful cavity, or have a denture made. Murray did not observe any fillings or other examples of dental work. In all likelihood, she believes, these people were too poor to have anyone attend to their dental problems.
These teeth that you see missing here, these were lost after death. You can see that because the sockets are still there, the sockets are empty.
When a tooth is lost before death, whether by accident or extraction, over time the tooth socket and bone heals over, creating a noticeable gap in the gum line.
In this case, the teeth are in very good shape. This person had little tooth wear, they had no cavities. This person had relatively healthy teeth.
In a time when little was known about preventative dental care, the reason for this person's healthy teeth, Murray feels, could simply be they were born with better genetics, or possibly ate a diet that promoted better dental health. Skulls can also tell a lot about an individual. Some features can suggest whether a person was a man or a woman. Most female skulls have smooth foreheads and delicate landmarks, while the male features are usually more exaggerated.
You can see, for example, in this skull, which is clearly male, you've got this very robust brow ridge, a big brooding kind of a forehead on this individual. I think this is my favorite skull in the collection because you get this sense of a dark, brooding face, coarse features, someone that, you know, I could imagine working on a canal boat in downtown Cincinnati. As you look at the bones, you sort of imagine the stories that go along with it. You go for the stories behind the bones. You look for the history because that puts it into the context. So in reading about early Cincinnati and being a Cincinnatian myself, knowing some of the history here, you kind of place these people in the settings that are familiar to you. You know, a canal boat on the Ohio River, or someone that was a seamstress in a factory downtown. Puts a face on the bones.
Murray's research showed that the music hall skeleton collection represented at least 30 and possibly as many as 70 adult individuals. 2/3 of them were most likely men. Was it only an accident that the graves of more men than women were uncovered when workers remodeled Music Hall in 1927? Or were more men originally buried in the Potter's Field in the 1800s? What other secrets were held within the Music Hall bones? Why human bones had been discovered by construction workers in the Cincinnati Music Hall's elevator shaft was no longer a great mystery. With some dogged detective work, Dr. Elizabeth Murray discovered the bones were unceremoniously buried there after being accidentally dug up when the building was remodeled in 1927. But what was still puzzling to her was why there were more men found in this collection than women. These bones had more to say.
I think we all have this Halloween notion of the skeleton being something very static. It's just, you know, like one size fits all. But to an anthropologist, you know, no two skulls are alike. No two people are alike. And we accept that when we look at people's facial features. We accept that when we know their personalities. But to an anthropologist, we accept that about the skeleton as well.
The disproportionate number of men in this sample sent her back to research additional historical records, including census data from the early 1800s. She wanted to know if there were more men than women living in Cincinnati at that time, or if there were reasons why men were more likely than women to wind up in a public burial ground.
Oh, definitely a major industry.
Dan Hurley is a historian and TV journalist in Cincinnati. He has spent years studying the city and its residents, both past and present. Murray met with Hurley at the Cincinnati Historical Society. She hoped he would have insight as to why more men than women were found in the Music Hall skeleton collection.
In the earliest years, Cincinnati was just a scruffy river town with a lot of promise, but it very quickly became the center of tremendous growth.
Cincinnati was at the western edge of the American frontier, so it was a great way station for American immigrants moving westward. By 1828, it was often referred to as the Queen City of the West.
You could even call it the first boom town in the United States after the founding of the United States as an independent nation. This is the first place that really takes off. The West is opened up, it's on this navigable river, and literally thousands of people are pouring into this place. From about 1835 till about 1855, all sorts of people came. Families came. Men came by themselves, some women came by themselves. In all frontier or close to frontier societies, men tend to predominate. There tend to be more men because they can strike out on their own, establish a foothold, and then send for their families later on. So there's a tendency for a higher percentage of men in the population than there is for women or established families. But all of those people were here. People of all backgrounds and all descriptions were here.
Hurley's explanation about why there were more men in the population in this mid-1800s frontier town makes sense to Dr. Murray. And she has her own thoughts about why they may have ended up in the cemetery for the poor and unknown.
I imagine young men coming to establish themselves and possibly begin to save up and send for their families back east. This notion of go west, young man. Many times, if something unfortunate happened and you weren't established and you didn't have family, you might be the kind of person that would wind up in a potter's field. So for these men, maybe they were never reunited with their families back east.
The average life expectancy of these Cincinnatians and the health factors that contributed to it were not the same as they are today.
From a 21st century perspective, the key difference between us and them is the reduction of infant mortality. Beyond that, what we can say is that if you survived the first 5 years, your chances of living a relatively long life, or maybe even a very long life, were fairly good, except for this. Death was part of everyday life. People were healthy one day, and they died the next day. And that was part of reality. You gotta remember, our whole medical model of illness simply didn't exist in the 19th century.
Life in the 1800s may have been unpredictable, but the expansion of the western part of the U.S. was unstoppable, and Cincinnati was a major destination. Tens of thousands of people from Western and Eastern Europe flooded in from the Northeast. And from the South came newly freed slaves looking to establish a home in the free state of Ohio. Different bones of the skeleton often suggest a person's ancestry. By looking at the skulls of the music hall collection, Dr. Murray was able to identify features of both European and African Americans.
Someone of African ancestry might have this, what we call a guttered nasal sill on the nasal region, where the nose is formed here, and also might have this kind of projection of the upper jaw. That would indicate somebody possibly of African ancestry.
People of European ancestry would have sharper nasal features, as well as a flatter upper jaw. Murray's observations of the bones told her that as many as 40 to 60% of the people in the music hall sample could have been of African ancestry. This was much higher than she expected, especially based on Cincinnati census data from that period of time. The collection of bones was turning out to be a diverse group of 19th century individuals, both in sex and ancestry. But the latest findings, this high percentage of African American bones, was perplexing, and Dr. Murray hoped history could explain the reason for this latest twist in the story of the music hall bones. The mysterious collection of bones from beneath Cincinnati's music hall was telling many of its secrets. Between 30 and 70 adults were buried in this old potter's field. 3/4 of them were male, and as many as 60% could have been of African ancestry, a much higher percentage than reflected in census data from that period.
There are several theories that could explain the disproportionately high number of African Americans probably represented in the music hall sample. One is that, unfortunately, in cemeteries, historically, people were segregated in death as well as in life. And it may be the particular area where individuals of African ancestry were buried. Secondly, it could reflect social times, in that it's possible that the Potter's Field was the place of burial for individuals of African descent. Christian cemeteries located nearby may have not socially accepted blacks being buried in them.
Dan Hurley has studied the life of African Americans living in Cincinnati in the late 1800s.
Cincinnati sits right on the Ohio River. The Ohio River was the dividing line between slavery and freedom, or at least between the slave states and the technically free states. so that this was a place for people to come initially if they were coming out of slavery. And many, many people who came out of slavery came to Cincinnati and stayed here. About 60% of all the people who came had purchased their freedom. They weren't runaways, they weren't part of the Underground Railroad, they weren't born free. About 60% had been born in slavery, had worked side jobs, and purchased their freedom.
According to Hurley, many of the African Americans who came north stayed in Cincinnati to remain close to family members who were still enslaved in the South. Eventually, some freemen even managed to save enough money to buy their loved ones out of slavery. But jobs at this time were limited for African Americans. Men could work as laborers, and the most lucrative opportunity was working as roustabouts on the steamboats. For women, virtually the only way they could earn any money was by doing domestic work.
Given the fact that African Americans were, generally speaking, at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, I think we can safely say that many of them died without having the ability to pay for their own burial and not being affiliated with a church that had its own burying ground. As a result, many of them would have ended up in the public burying ground and being buried at public expense.
One of the most powerful stories told by the bones of the Music Hall collection is the story of work. The kind of hard physical labor needed to build a rapidly growing city.
Here we can see typical normal development in one of the bones of the spine. But on this side, we can see a lot of bony growths that would be very painful for that person. It would indicate that that person had wear and tear arthritis, probably associated with a hard-working lifestyle.
In general, the skeletons of the Music Hall collection suggest a population that was physically strong and healthy. Little evidence of common diseases or disorders of the day, like arthritis, rickets, or syphilis, were seen in the bones. These findings were not surprising to Dr. Murray. Infectious illnesses of the time, such as cholera and tuberculosis, would usually be quickly fatal and would not leave their mark on bones. She did, however, see examples of clear traumatic injuries, old, healed fractures.
For example, these two bones that would be between your knee and your ankle are normally separated. But here we can see a fracture of some sort or an infection has bridged these two bones and held them together even in death. I like to romanticize about the people that lived at that time. Perhaps this man had his ankle run over by a wagon wheel or was stepped on by a horse.
Whoa.
Any number of things that might have happened to cause this poorly healed fracture.
You be all right?
As an anthropologist who has studied bones for years, Dr. Murray knew the remains could reveal more information than her eyes could see, especially about nutrition and growth patterns. As part of her analysis, she x-rayed a sample of the long bones at the Hamilton County Coroner's Office. Bernie Kersker is a retired homicide detective who was the director of the morgue at the time the bones were discovered. Recently, Murray met with him and talked about the steps they took in the X-ray analysis. Although generally healthy, a few of the bones X-rayed showed patterns suggesting that some of these adults, during their childhood, had stopped growing for a while, possibly due to illness or poor nutrition.
These lines that you see on here, they're called lines of growth arrest, Harris lines of growth arrest, and they represent where, when this person was a child, they may have stopped growing and started growing again, like the rings in a tree.
But the lines are also further proof of the hardiness of these people, because they show an individual survived that stress to their skeleton and then continued their normal growth. In addition to the X-ray analysis of the bones, Murray orders a few chemical tests to see what they could tell her about these people's diets.
I took one element, just the left upper arm bone, from 10 individuals, and I removed some cores of bone and sent them away to a laboratory for chemical analysis.
When the results from the lab came back, she was surprised to find that one of the most important contributors to the growth of Cincinnati was not a worker, a pioneer, or a financier. Instead, it was most likely a pig. Dr. Murray's study of the music hall bones had revealed a glimpse into the lives of some of the earliest inhabitants of the city of Cincinnati. The skeletons represented poor, hardworking people, many of whom were males and African Americans. Skeletal analysis helped reconstruct physical aspects of their health and biology, but chemical testing from a sample of the bones shed light on the kinds of foods these people may have eaten.
We get this tendency to think of poor people as having bad nutrition, poor nutrition, being malnourished, but the music hall sample had a high percentage of protein in the diet.
Murray had the chemical proof that these people most likely ate a high percentage of protein. But if these remains were those of common working people, how could they afford to put high-protein food sources on their tables? She asked historian Dan Hurley.
Cincinnati sits not only at the midpoint of the Ohio River, but between the two Miami rivers. And this is a great agricultural valley. It's a valley that was producing huge amounts of grain, particularly corn. The way to get corn to the market was to feed it to pigs, and then they became walking sacks of grain who could be driven to market.
Between the first frost of the year and early spring, farmers drove hundreds of thousands of pigs through the streets of Cincinnati. By the mid-1800s, not only had Cincinnati become the largest pork packing center in the United States, but the largest pork packing center in the world.
One of the problems with trying to recreate older cities is we never quite capture the smell. The smell was distinct and pungent and difficult. So not only did pigs leave droppings, but they also would die and croak on the way, or they would run off. Now, people could capture a stray pig and slaughter it for their own purposes. They could pick up a recently dead pig, cut it up and use it. But even so, they could also buy pork very cheaply from the slaughterhouses. There were always pigs in the streets of Cincinnati and in any city, really.
Thus, one explanation for how Cincinnati earned the colorful nickname Porkopolis.
We were known for the meatpacking industry well back into the early 1900s. And stories recount pigs being driven up from the canal boats and so forth up through the town to the slaughterhouses. And if you could run fast enough to catch a feral pig, a wild pig, you had pork for dinner that night. And so these people weren't starving in the sense of, other impoverished people. They may just have had to work a little harder or run a little faster for their dinner.
It looks great.
Meat was plentiful and available to even the poorest households, just as the chemical analysis suggested. But the Cincinnati diet included a much greater variety of foods than simply pork.
You got to remember also, Cincinnati, being in this agricultural region, was a place where a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables were brought in. This was a seasonal sort of thing, but people understood that. They canned. They were able to go into the markets, to the city's 6 public markets, buy these goods directly from farmers and pack them up. So besides the meat, which was what carried the protein, you had lots of vegetables, lots of fruits. So relatively speaking, for a large city, this was a healthy place to live. This was a good diet.
The chemical analysis also showed that the bones contained a number of metals, including lead, since only the rich of that day could afford to set their tables with lead-glazed pottery or pewter mugs. Only they, according to Dr. Murray, could be susceptible to accumulating high levels of lead in their skeletons. The people buried in the potter's field could not have afforded to eat off such finery and thus would not have had the same opportunity to accumulate lead in their bones.
The chemical analysis in this case helped substantiate that these people really were from the lower strata of society. They were commoners.
Other metals studied through bone chemistry hinted at a unique and possibly tragic story in one man's life. One of the males sampled was found with at least one type of metal in his bones that probably reached toxic levels.
When the chemical analysis came back, one particular individual had unusually high copper, zinc, and cadmium levels. Zinc and copper are typically found in low levels in the skeleton, very trace levels, but this person had levels that were significantly higher than anyone else in this music hall sample. The interesting feature there was the cadmium. Cadmium is quite toxic at high levels, and for a person to have these metals in their skeleton suggests an occupational exposure, that this person was somehow exposed to those three metals in a way that no one else in this sample was.
Dan Hurley was able to take Murray's scientific findings and put them into historical perspective.
Since this was the supply center and the manufacturing center to supply people moving farther west, you had a whole range of manufacturing here. You had clothes being manufactured here. You had metal goods being manufactured here. Cincinnati becomes, what, the second or third largest steamboat manufacturing center in the United States. Well, as part of that, there's a lot of metal tools going into that. The chemistry of that is still a 19th century chemistry, and you end up in that iron with cadmium, you end up with other trace minerals that no one even would have given a thought to this being a problem, even if they could have identified them.
If, as the expression goes, work can sometimes kill you, the high level of cadmium in one man's skeleton may have contributed to his death.
If it's an occupational exposure, then you would assume that this man had a job and had this job for a long time in order to accumulate those metals in his skeleton. But cadmium, in the advanced stages of the disease, my research showed that it would be of the levels to make somebody possibly experience some psychological or dementia or health-related changes. And it may have been this man went from being a productive citizen at one time to being buried in a potter's field because of steadily declining mental health. So here we have a glimpse of what may have been this person's social fate despite a once healthy career.
The discovery of a mysterious collection of human bones during the renovation of an elevator shaft at the Cincinnati Music Hall in 1988 turned out to be a rare find. The study of this collection of bones provided significant clues to the human biology and lives of early European and West African inhabitants of Cincinnati, who, in turn, represented the thousands like them who moved west and helped settle this country.
I think their health and their stature shows that these were very hardy people. These were survivors. They may have wound up in a potter's field, but we're all going to wind up buried somewhere someday. The average lifespan of these people may have only been 40 to 45 years of age, but I think they lived a thorough, hardy life.
Unfortunately, there's no written record to tell the story of these forgotten people.
Historians in the past have tended to focus so much of their attention on the famous people that they haven't paid a lot of attention to ordinary people. But there's a real tendency in the field of history, especially in social history, today and for the last 25 years, to really focus on what I would refer to as ordinary people in everyday times.
The story of the Music Hall bones began with their mysterious discovery in 1988. By applying today's knowledge of forensic anthropology, Dr. Elizabeth Murray's study of these remains led to an amazing investigative journey where history and science intersected to tell the stories of some long-forgotten people whose labors helped build the city of Cincinnati.